Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Christopher Blattman. His new book is Why We Fight, subtitled The Roots of War and the Paths to Peace. Christopher is the Romilly E. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago, where he co-leads the Development Economic Center and directs the Obama Foundation's Scholars Program. His work on violence, crime, and poverty has been widely covered by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Forbes, Slate, Fox, and NPR. So we cover, well, the exact title and subtitle of the book, Why Do People Fight? Not just wars, but conflicts of all sizes and kinds. He mainly discusses group conflict, so he's not studying homicides in this particular book, but the roots are largely in 5 different stages. So we go through what those 5 causes are that leads to conflict between groups, and then, as the subtitle says, the paths to peace. He has 10 commandments in the final chapter of what it takes to get there. As you'll hear, there are no simple solutions. There's no utopian, ideological, overreaching theory that explains everything. In fact, because Christopher's personal research involves often going to these places where there is conflict, it shows that simple ideas almost never work. Every situation is different. But he nevertheless is still able to derive out of that certain principles that you can try to apply elsewhere. They may or may not work, but at least they have a better than random chance of working. So we go through all the details on that and as well hit some of the big issues that I'm always interested in, the nature of human nature. Did we evolve to be highly in conflict with each other, or are we by nature cooperative? And to what extent do in-group, out-group biases and xenophobias and prejudices like that come naturally to us? And if so, what can we do about it? That is, we talk about our better angels and our inner demons and how those push and tug against each other. To what extent our paleolithic ancestors were violent and in large conflict like many groups are today. And if so, what that says about human nature. And if not, then why are we experiencing so much conflict in the modern world? And then, the big picture again, putting this into context because the book was written before Putin invaded Ukraine. So I also ask him about that and what his predictions are, which of course are difficult to make, especially about the future. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this really enlightening and important conversation with Christopher Blattman. Thanks for listening. Okay, we are live. Christopher Blattman, thanks for coming on the show. Congratulations on the new book. I have to tell you, I really like an author who comes up with a title and subtitle that are both descriptive. No flowery literary style titles here. Why We Fight. Okay, that's what this book is about.
Thank you.
And then The Roots of War and the Paths to Peace. Oh, that would be a good idea. If we could figure out how to reduce the amount of fighting. So I loved your book. I've read a lot of books on war and human conflict and violence and so on. And the one thing I liked about yours is that it's not just airy-fairy, theoretical, academic, ivory tower stuff. You've had boots on the ground, so to speak, or at least your shoes on the ground in many places around the world. So part of the problem with all these grand theories, like the McDonald's theory of peace, no 2 countries that has McDonald's will fight, except for when they do. Or no 2 democracies ever fight, except for when they do. And so you show how when you actually get down to the nitty gritty with these groups that are in conflict, no one grand theory explains everything, but there are some principles you can derive. So we'll get into those in a minute. But let's just start with your background. Some of your book is autobiographical, which I really loved, about your experiences. So just give us a little bit of background, where you grew up and where you went to school and how you got interested in this topic.
Sure. So I grew up in Canada, all over Eastern Ontario, especially in Ottawa. So not a lot of violence or political instability. And I had never given any of this really a thought. Never really left the country until I was an adult, finished college. I mean, if you ignore the trip to Disney World. And and I, like a lot of members of my family, I was sort of headed on a career in business, and I actually was working as an accountant for Deloitte and Touche. So this was not the auspicious beginning towards this kind of career, and I didn't really enjoy it. And I got interested in issues of poverty and inequality, but I looked around in Canada and it didn't seem that soluble. It seemed like there were a lot of people working on it, and maybe we were down to the last mile and it was a very difficult problem, but there were a lot of problems in the world that there weren't as many people putting their shoulder behind. And so I started working abroad, and I studied in the United States in international development, and that was the path I was on. I was going to be a development economist. I was going to think about the growth, the wealth of nations, right? And so I wasn't going to write a book about why we fight. I thought, oh, maybe in 20 years I'll write a book about the wealth and poverty of nations. And I was doing my part looking at industrial growth in East Africa, because if I thought, well, if you want to alleviate poverty in Africa, fundamentally you need to have lots of GDP, and GDP comes from industry, and so let's study the most successful industrial places. And as I talk about in the book, one day two con artists stole my laptop. So I found myself in an internet cafe, and it was 2004, and I was checking my Hotmail, which sort of tells you how long ago this was. And in those days, because Kenya wasn't yet on sort of the global internet cable, runs under the Atlantic or wherever it is, or the Indian Ocean, it took like 10 minutes for a email to load. And it was normal to sit in these cafes and chat to the person next to you for those 10 minutes. So I strategically chose to sit down next to this attractive woman who was sitting in the internet cafe as well. And we got to chatting, and she was a humanitarian worker and a psychologist working in a conflict, in which I'd never really given much thought to. And so long story short, I ended up in a conflict zone a year later because I was chasing a woman. But inescapably, you're in a place like this, and you have to sort of ask yourself, why is this happening? And like, what could I do to reduce it? Because all of the things that I'd been concerned about up to that point just didn't seem to pale in importance to like just the horrors of what I saw on the ground, which in this case was in northern Uganda, and sort of the trailing end days of a 20-year really brutal civil conflict. And so that kind of changed my life. And I spent, so she and I, we're now married for, what are we now? 15 years, I think. And we have 2 kids. So that was a productive decision, but it also turned into a career where initially together, and then we studied this, doing a lot of work on the victims of violence, but I transitioned, she still does that. I transitioned to studying why the perpetrators. And so that's, anyway, so that's sort of my weird way from, Canadian accountant to professor studying warfare.
That's really funny. Women in war, that's, we're just apes, really. That's what it comes down to.
It's true.
That's great. I'm always interested, as a sidebar, in how lives turn out and the different factors that go into it, your genes and your environment and your parental upbringing and your mentors. But luck, your laptop gets stolen, you're in this internet cafe, and there's this woman, and now 15 years later, you have 2 kids and you're a professor, and then you have this whole other life. Had you turned left instead of right, or had the laptop not been stolen, or you'd gone to some other internet cafe, how different would your life have been? It's just so interesting. And
I spend also 2 hours a week like talking to a lot of people, versions of my younger self, who are students at the undergraduates or master's students at the policy school where I teach, come in asking for career advice, and I try to help them sort of think about how to be more strategic about what they want to do, but I do try to emphasize that, whatever you think you're going to be doing in 5 years is probably not even close to what you will actually be working on. And so focus on some fundamentals. And so the most common piece of career advice I give them is just, if you're presented with a choice, take the path that leaves the most future paths open and the most other doors open, because you just want to create room for those opportunities.
But how do you know if you have a kind of a still small voice within saying, this path I'm going down just doesn't feel quite right, and then maybe there's 3 different paths? How do you know which one is the right one? I mean, what would you tell an undergraduate or a graduate student?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to sample if you can. I mean, that's, I sampled a lot of careers, after feeling sort of an accountant, I tried business consulting, and then I tried international development policy, and then I sampled academia, and then within academia, I sampled different things. And so I tried to always bite off these careers in maybe 2 or 3 month chunks. And so that's what internships or short jobs or assistantships or things were. So I tried to think of it as sampling. And I take that approach to a lot of that. So I take that approach to how I read books. I take that approach to what plays I go to. I'm willing to skim a chapter, put it down. I'm willing to go to the first act, stop. I'm willing to walk out if I don't really enjoy my meal. And I quit maybe more quickly than other people. And I see that as a virtue, not as a lack of commitment or some kind of defect.
Yes, although at some point you do make a decision because you gotta pay the mortgage and so on, and now you have a job and you're in this department, and so I'd say at this point you're probably committed to what you're doing. So at some point, probably in maybe your early to mid 20s, do the sampler tray and see which one feels right or whatever. Yeah, that's good. So your book you finished before the whole Putin Ukraine thing. Were you surprised? Like everybody says, oh, we were so surprised. We never thought he would do that. Actually invade Ukraine rather than annex just the Donbas region and all that. Were you taken by surprise?
Yeah, and I'm on record. I wrote in the weeks leading up to the war, not because I have any special knowledge of Russia or Ukraine. I mean, if a war tragically had to break out around the time of this book, and you said where in the world do you know the least, you wouldn't. Russia and Ukraine wouldn't be number one, but it'd definitely be up there. And so I don't want to pretend any knowledge, but just sort of working off some general principles in what we know from the past, and even what we know from Putin's behavior and Putin's opponents' behaviors elsewhere. I said, listen, it's improbable. Like the most likely path is that they will find some sort of compromise, and it will be bitter and unequal because Russia is much stronger than Ukraine, and they're in a position to exercise, and they have leverage over the Ukraine and the West, and they want to use it. And most of the time in those circumstances, people swallow that bitter pill and they compromise because war would just be so unthinkably costly as it has been. And so, we saw Belarus has essentially conceded a lot of its independence and succumbed, and to a certain extent other neighbors like Kazakhstan. And so I thought that we would see a similar set of events play out in Russia. And I still think in Russia's behavior towards Ukraine and Ukraine's decision to resist or not. And we didn't. And I still think it was the right call, not because I'm stubborn, because I think it's always essentially the right call. But in this, so then it becomes a process of after the fact sort of diagnosing, like, why didn't this normal, natural thing that usually happens, which is bitter compromise, why didn't it happen?
Right. I think I misspoke. It's the Donbass region, not the Donbas region. Right. Well, and that's what everybody predicted based on what happened with the annexation of Crimea, just chipping away in like Georgia, Chechnya, Syria, and so on, just little local conflicts and influences. Yeah, so I mean, for sure, the destruction we see on the nightly news is just astounding. You wonder if he ends up taking Ukraine, what is there to take? There's just just rubble on top of rubble at this point in the major cities. Mm-hmm. It must be the natural resources or whatever.
Well, I mean, there are natural resources, and the one thing we know from post-conflict environments is the rubble very quickly turns back into buildings and productive capital. So Germany and Japan, after their wars, and like many other places, bounce back very quickly, provided there's some institutional stability after the fact. So he could, whatever he grabs, might be. I don't think it will ever be worth it. It was always going to be better for them to find some negotiated agreement that might have even seen Ukraine give up some of its autonomy or make some painful sacrifices. But one way I look at this actually is I see a lot of parallels to the American Revolution, which is a conflict I learned a lot about in the process of writing the book, because I wanted to sort of I don't study the American. I work mostly on African civil wars and and gang wars in Latin America and in the U.S. But one of the chief historical accounts of the American Revolution is, a good example is historian Bernard Bailyn talks about the ideological origins. And so here's this tyrannical superpower that has demanding that their colonists accept semi-sovereignty, pay more taxes. No, you're not going to be fully independent. You'll have some degree of local autonomy. There can be limits. And most colonists look at most imperial powers and the might they wield and sort of accept that compromise. They don't particularly enjoy it. But it's all their military strength earns them. And in the stories, that's kind of probably what the Americans should have done, but for an ideological attachment to the idea of liberty, that this compromise was simply repugnant. And they persuaded enough Americans that this compromise was repugnant, that they rejected the only compromise that their military strength earned them, and they fought a war, and they could have lost it. In fact, they probably would have lost it if not for foreign intervention. And so here we have a pretty similar situation. We have a relatively weak country, no military allies, economically stagnant for 30 years, lower incomes per capita in Ukraine now than in 1990. And then you have a resurgent Russia, oil and gas revenues, consolidated political control, booming economy to a large extent before this conflict, that said, we want, it's time for us to take back more than what we've got. We need a bigger share of the pie. And Ukraine, for its military weakness, probably should have, in some sense, right? Because I'm very sympathetic to I'm an American. I took American citizenship actually a few years ago, and so I'm sympathetic to the ideals of liberty, obviously. And I think that's the story. I think, like the Americans, they said no. Even if it means losing, we will not accept this compromise. It's simply repugnant. And so there's a story that says, there's one version which I don't hear people telling is this war is the reason is Ukrainian intransigence, like noble, admirable Ukrainian intransigence. And I think that's why Americans and Western Europeans are so eager to support them. And maybe why so many other people in the rest of the world are a little bit less partisan in this and a little bit less sympathetic.
Right. And in your 5 factors that go into explaining why we fight, to what extent does, Putin's ego, Russian nationalism, the greatness of Mother Russia, what it used to be, he's on record saying, the breakup of the Soviet Union is the worst thing that happened in the 20th century, and so on. How do you factor that in, with numbers or in your kind of calculation?
Yeah, so I just told a story where it was the ideas or the ideology of Ukrainians that led them to refuse a compromise that they should have done based on just basic sort of realpolitik calculus. And the story you just told, which is the dominant story out there, which might also be true, I think it's partly true. I think I'm less persuaded of it being, I don't know, the main story. But that's a different kind of intangible, which is whatever set of nationalistic or status seeking or other sort of ideals and incentives that Putin has, simply because he values them, something that he can only attain through war. And so both of these, in the book, as the main argument, which I think is sort of comes to us from decades of social science research, is that sort of what I'm saying, most of the time war doesn't happen. We negotiate because war is so costly. And so anytime war does happen, it's because something overcame that incredibly powerful incentive. So peace has this gravitational pull that comes from the cost of war, and something equally large had to yank it out of that orbit. And one of those are these sort of intangibles, right? Could be the Ukrainian ideals that they reject the compromise, could be Putin's less noble status-seeking or nationalistic ideals. And those, in either case, if those are what's going on, we're basically making an argument that they ignored the costs, or they didn't ignore the costs, but these other benefits, these ethereal benefits, outweighed the costs. And so it's actually just one of the 5 ways. But I think those 2 alone could help us understand a lot of this conflict. But I don't know that it's personally. I don't think it's sufficient. For me, I like to add 2 more things, which are 2 of the other 5 ways that so one is, so I think absolutely these intangibles on the Ukrainian side are critical. I think doesn't hurt to have hurt. I mean, from the perspective of explaining war, it doesn't hurt to have a nationalistic or glory-seeking leader. But I don't think we can underestimate how fundamental it is that that one of these sides is an autocracy. Putin is a relatively personalized autocrat, which means he doesn't bear a lot of the costs of warfare, so we can avoid a lot of them. So war is less of a puzzle or a mystery if at least one side isn't incorporating a lot of these costs into their calculus. But maybe more importantly, like he is this idea that he may have a private incentive to fight, even if Russia does not. So it's not in the interest of Russia to fight, but it might be in the interest of Putin to fight, because a democratic and Western-facing Ukraine is a threat to him. It's a threat to his apparatus of control. And curtailing that and creating a neutral, less militarized, and non-democratic Ukraine would probably strengthen and preserve his rule to some degree. So the Ukraine's democracy and wealth and closeness to the West is not a threat to ordinary Russians. It's a threat to his regime. And so that private incentive, this cold calculating, not glory and nationalistic things, but cold calculating self-interest for the preservation of his regime, strikes me as much more important in understanding why he would ask Ukrainians to pay such a cruel price. Right. And then the second thing that I think is really important, and I think you alluded to it before, is a third of these buckets, which is uncertainty. And think about all of the things, all the ways in which so many people were surprised. I think most people were surprised that the Ukrainians were this plucky and capable. I think most people were surprised, including probably Putin, by the performance of his army. And I think most people were surprised by the unity and coherence of Western sanctions. Right? All of these things that happened in the end were within the realm of possibilities. Everyone knew they were out there, but nobody thought they were particularly likely. They were all kind of tail events, and they all resolved in a way that was actually quite unfavorable to Russia. And so if you're Putin making a choice about, listen, do I find a way, do I compromise or do I invade? And amongst this sort of fog of war and fog of potential war, all these things that could resolve themselves that are uncertain now, do I really think it's all going to go against me? Well, probably not, right? And the Ukrainians might say they're plucky, and the West says, no, we really mean it. We're super unified this time. But do I believe them? Is that a credible signal? Should I update my beliefs? Or do I think they're bluffing? And they're bluffing because if they know if they successfully bluff, then I'm going to concede more than I ought to give up, given how strong I am. And so you don't need him to. You hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, he miscalculated, he misjudged." I mean, I think he got unlucky in his guesses, because there were all these tail events. But I don't know if it was beforehand a poor judgment. I mean, listen, I don't favor this war. I mean, so when I say I think it was a poor judgment for lots of reasons, but do I think it was like a miscalculation? Not necessarily. I think the uncertainty is overwhelming. So so we don't need Putin to be nationalistic and glory-seeking to explain this war. It might help. We just need him to be self-interested in the preservation of his regime. We need him to be facing a lot of uncertainty, and we need the Ukrainians to be intransigent and not to accept deals that would lead them to sacrifice sovereignty, even if they're weak. And then I think we're most of the way there. And the only reason the last thing I just want to say is the only reason his nationalism or his glory-seeking or his mistakes, because he did make mistakes, matter is because these other three fundamental forces made it so difficult to navigate this through negotiation, and that the mistakes mattered. And that's kind of my view in general, that these mistakes and miscalculations always matter, but they mostly matter when these other more fundamental things have really narrowed the range of possible deals.
Right. So maybe the hindsight bias is kicking in here, and we're seeing what happened and then rewinding the tape and said, he should have seen this too. So what you're saying is, from Putin's perspective, it's kind of a signal detection problem. So his priors were that, well, if I nudge a little bit here and a little bit there, I'll get away with it, because look what happened with Georgia, Chechnya, Syria, Crimea, and Obama said, I'm going to draw the line in the sand, and then didn't.
Exactly.
And this happened over and over. So his priors told him, well,
that's very important. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a calculated gamble, and he just happened to get it wrong. It's not that he was irrational or insanely mad. He's not a madman in that sense. So trying to see it from.
I think most people don't talk about that history. I do think you're right. Like, Putin was looking at a long record of encroachments listen, from one perspective, Russia was weak in the years after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the West took great advantage of that to push incredibly far east in their political and economic influence. And Russia resented that, never was worth their while to fight. And now that they're stronger, like, okay, it's time for us to get a little bit more elbow room and have our own kind of Monroe doctrine or Monroevsky doctrine. And Syria and Iran and Georgia, all these things. And he's mostly gotten his way. And furthermore, American presidents like Obama, and that famous red line cross that America did not respond, was a very dangerous and problematic choice. And it helped, all of these events helped bring us to where we are today, and a strategic decision to invade. I just don't think we can ignore those, and yet you're one of the very few people I've talked to who sort of raises that sort of history and points out all of these little cases and says, well, we kind of got his way here, got his way there, until he didn't.
Until he didn't, yeah. And it's also good to remember the history of democracy in Russia is not very deep. You had, just a smattering for, a year and a half in 1917, 18, before the Civil War between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and then that was the end of that once the communists won. And then you had Gorbachev, who was not democratically elected, but then, with perestroika and all that, and openness to the West. And then there was a coup, and he got arrested. And then Yeltsin, and then he was not a great leader, and the alcoholic, so on. And he appoints Putin, and that's it. We're done. That's the history of democracy in Russia.
Right.
It's just not encouraging.
Well, what was maybe more, for me, what's more important when it comes to checking leaders and making war less likely, I mean, having mass elections is potentially is important. I mean, but leaders who just face elections and don't face any other legislatures or courts or other bases of power that aren't necessarily formal, like powerful business cliques, they find it very easily to manipulate elections. And so, in some sense, the checks that I think really matter for warfare and thinking about warfare are maybe these checks and balances in, like, the Madisonian sense of dividing power across arms of government, across to local levels, to supranational levels, and what Putin managed to do. And so Yeltsin was somebody who was reasonably checked in some ways. There was a big group of people who were quite powerful. Yeltsin was perhaps chief among them, but not so much so. And what Putin did over 20 years or more was actually really personalize power. Meaning, and I think that is what made this so risky. That it meant that war, we don't need it to be very much in his private interests for him to go to war. We don't. He ignores a lot more costs if he's that unchecked. And then we're also subject to more of the whims of, an autocrat's delusions or mistakes when power is personalized. So I think that's so not all autocracies are equal. China is a good example of a much more institutionalized autocracy where there's a lot more checks and balances. But the current president is moving it in a problematic direction. He's trying to create a system more personalized rule. And if he's successful in becoming more Mao-like than more Putin-like in his personalization, I would worry a lot about the future. And the fact that that hasn't happened yet makes me more optimistic about, the probabilities that China goes to war with its neighbors or with the United States. So anyways, just to say that I think it's less about elections and it's more about these more institutionalized checks that I think really create a more peaceful set of countries.
Yeah, I've been binge watching the Oliver Stone Putin interviews because I have Stone coming on the podcast, and it's astonishing how much rationalization Putin has for every one of Stone's pushbacks. Like, what about Chechnya? What about Georgia? And then he would ramble on for like 20 minutes. Oh, well, here's what was actually going on there. There's these breakaway groups, these terrorists, these criminals, and we had to do this and that and this and we had this treaty and we obeyed the treaty and they didn't obey the treaty and the U.S. broke the treaty, and on and on and on. And by the time you're like, oh my God, this guy, yeah, he's not just a bullshitter. I think in his head, he thinks everything I'm doing is justified. From the West, of course, we see him as this autocrat. But in his own head, if you try to, see it from his perspective so we can understand why he's doing what he's doing, my guess is he's even got some complex 20-minute long answer for why did you invade Ukraine? Oh, well, here's why. Because you guys did this and then they did that. So we had to do this. And, it'll be interesting if we ever hear that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I never, I think partly we should take those things seriously. Like, I never know how much is sort of propaganda or ways of justifying with any leader, right? Democratic as well. You're trying to create a narrative that people will get behind. It may or may not be what you believe. I wonder how much of it boils down to self-delusion of, I just convinced myself that I'm just doing tit for tat, versus how much of it is just sort of outlining this sort of kind of cold realpolitik that I think does govern. We don't like to believe it's how the world works, but it's actually how the world works, actually how America behaves in the world as well, which is to say that when we are strong, we will take what we want and we'll find a way to justify it in order to make it politically palatable, or at least as politically palatable as possible to our publics or to ourselves. But at the end of the day, we're just going to justify taking what we want when we're strong. And that kind of realpolitik, I think, does dominate. And we push back at it with ideals, and I think those ideals really matter in constraining it. But we don't even do a great job of constraining our own government sometimes in acting this way. I mean, the parallel, just to sort of make it a little bit, I always try to put myself in the other person's shoes. I haven't watched these interviews, but I will now. The way I think about it is how would we feel if over the last 30 years, the Venezuela and Cuba not only became more socialist and communist and Russian facing, but all of Central America. And now Mexico was teetering on the brink of joining this bloc. And it was just encroachment after encroachment. Like it's not that the United States, I think the United States would do something about that. They did do something about that. That was exactly like all the shenanigans in Central America and all the political meddling that's been going on for so many decades did happen for those kinds of reasons, right? And so we don't have to think it's right, but we can kind of what's called strategic empathy, which is at least try to understand the logic. And think about how we have behaved in a similar way. It's, ultimately, do I think the United States would invade Mexico to stop that from happening if necessary? I think we can all say, yeah, there's a good chance. And would we, as a democratic public, be satisfied with that? Well, maybe not. There's a lot of problems. We would like to find another way. But ultimately, if there were no choice and if Mexicans were intransigent, I think America might do that. And that might explain a lot of American invasions over the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, exactly. One of my explanations amongst the three big ones for why people believe conspiracy theories is what I call constructive conspiracism. That is, a lot of them are real. That is, the conspiracy theories have uncovered real conspiracies. And one of which is the United States trying to rig elections in Central and South American countries to favor, say, the fascist dictator over the communist dictator. Because at least the fascist dictators, you can do business with them. They won't nationalize your company, right? And so we fund this group and we back that dictator or whatever. He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And so if you do enough of that, and then you hear the rigged election, well, that would never happen in a democracy. Well, yeah, it does happen. We did do that. The CIA was involved in a lot of these things. So it's, it's not completely crazy to think that, that this one or that one is also real. Of course, again, it's a signal detection problem. We have to look at each one individually, but enough of them happen. It pays to be a little paranoid, even about your own government. So I do try to listen to people like Oliver Stone or Noam Chomsky, and they say, well, what's the difference between Russia invading Ukraine and the United States invading Iraq? Now, maybe Afghanistan's justifiable because of 9/11, and that's where Osama bin Laden was. But Iraq, what's the point of? What was the point of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, one of the differences between conspiracy theorists and me might just be my level of confidence in a lot of bureaucratic organizations to execute conspiracies well. So I think we're aware of a lot of the conspiracies that are, right. The Western and Russian meddling in Ukrainian elections and politics for the last 2 decades was in some ways quite transparent. And as they were all searching for ways to sort of fight over this territory without violence. And they were doing it through sponsoring of political parties and revolutions, buying this and buying that. In other cases, I do think we tend to, maybe the other thing that these conspiracy theories do, in Iraq's a good example, is I don't know that I think they underappreciate some of these more subtle strategic forces that do lead to something like an invasion, right? And so I think with Iraq, I think there's a tendency to sort of think about unchecked leaders, especially people thinking about, I don't know, U.S. presidents in the pocket of oil. And there's a tendency to think about intangible incentives. There's a tendency to think about Bush wanting to avenge, Saddam's attempted murder of his father and the failed, reinvasion of Iraq after the Kuwait War and so forth. And there's a tendency to also just say this was a big mistake. And there was an intelligence failure, which was actually true. I think that is much more true than the two other things I've just said. But then there's some other subtle logics. I mean, the political scientists I know and some colleagues of mine even who've studied this, sort of say, well, that might be true, but one is this was an area of tremendous uncertainty. So once again, here's this force of uncertainty that matters. It was actually somewhat uncertain whether or not Saddam had given up weapons of mass destruction. And this is in some ways a controversial thing to say now, but it's actually, I don't think it was a controversial thing to say within government circles at the time. There was genuine uncertainty. There was actually, most of the uncertainty was like, okay, even if he's given them up now, we think he could restart this within a few years if he really wanted to. So there was, but the other strategic force that I think really mattered there was one of these other 5 explanations I talked about, which is what political scientists like to call commitment problems. What others might call preventative wars, which is to say that, listen, I think the balance of power could shift very quickly. And so I can either deal with that and trust your assurances that you won't use your future influence to crush me or to really take advantage of the situation, or I could just invade now and avert your rise altogether. And that's explained a lot of wars in the past century. But it's one that many people think played a huge role in Iraq, which was the fear of a nuclear power, that getting a bomb would have totally changed the strategic balance of power in the Middle East. And so that commitment problem, coupled with the uncertainty that how easily could he start up, coupled with the intelligence failures and coupled with the unchecked leaders and coupled with all, I think, led to this invasion of Iraq. And I think it's a mistake for us to sort of blame it on blood for oil and errors alone, and then to forget this strategic logic. Once again, it's sort of like the Ukraine story. These mistakes and the idiosyncratic delusions of leaders or their pursuit of some other goal usually only matter when these more fundamental strategic forces have really limited the range of deals. Fundamental things like uncertainty and commitment problems and so forth. So that's not the conspiracy theory kind of story, which tends to be a little bit more monocausal.
I like how you use game theory in your book. I'm a big fan of game theory for explaining a lot of things. Here, there's a kind of logic to having nuclear weapons. The United States will not invade you. Mm-hmm. So when Kim Jong-un, he's why waste all this money on a nuke program when your people are starving? Well, because they'll leave me alone. That's why, and I get a chair at the table with the big boys, and I'll get respect. And of course,
yeah,
there's kind of a defensive move there. I understand why Iran might want to do that. Although I suppose we can't just step back and let them have that defensive narrative, because they are on record saying we would wipe out Israel if we could, even though Israel has nukes, and they would not wipe out Iran if they could. So there's that difference. And maybe we're making a kind of a moral decision there. We understand why Israel has them, and we're not going to block that. But you guys have a different attitude, so we are going to block that.
Yeah, I agree. Listen, every group, whether it's a nation or something, they're contesting something with their rival. They're contesting territory. They're contesting control over policy, whether it's the price of oil or how much is produced. They're contesting the existence of Israel, which is another, in some sense, a policy issue. It's a choice, right, that the world has made, or that nations have made, and they're contesting all of these things, and they would like to have more bargaining power. And weapons are a source of bargaining power, right? There are actually lots of sources of bargaining power, but just any weapon, developing a better rocket system, a defensive system, or a nuclear bomb is a way to get bargaining power. And so saying that nations want nuclear power, the nuclear arms rather, is a way of saying is partly, first and foremost, a way of saying they want more bargaining power. That there's this sort of weapon they could obtain and that you're keeping me from obtaining and making it more difficult. But if I do get it, then the power is really going to shift. So that's the main reason. And then, going back to this idea that war is destructive and most people avoid it. Well, if I attain more arms and bargaining power, then you're going to, and those arms are more powerful, and there's going to be something, maybe not mutually assured destruction, but really, really serious damage against one another at minimum. Well, you're going to really strive to avoid war. So if I can attain that, not only will I have more bargaining power, but there's probably even less likelihood of war because it's going to be such a doozy. Now, if it does happen, it's going to be really, really terrible. And so that's a kind of a terrible cloud for the whole world to live under. But it's sort of like a double incentive, I should say, to obtain these arms, that you gain more bargaining power, and then you probably even compel your opponent to negotiate even more than before. And so they strive, and then the other side strives to keep them from attaining that, even when necessary, using military force. And so that's kind of how I look at that.
Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of broad debate about to what extent humans are by nature cooperative or competitive, or we have our inner demons versus our better angels, and we're nice, we're nasty, whatever, good and evil. And okay, so clearly we're both. We have those elements within us. If I understand your book, you're saying that there's kind of, I guess, what we'd call, what Kahneman and Tversky call the availability heuristic. That is, if you just study war, it seems like we're always at war throughout history. This is in our nature. But your point is that, in fact, for every war, there's 10,000 possible other little conflicts and wars that never happened. And no one puts a camera crew at a conflict that doesn't actually erupt into violence. Just like school shootings, here we have the camera crew. Or
if they do put a camera crew, we don't watch the show, right? We change the channel. It's maybe the real problem, right?
Oh, they're negotiating and they've come up with a trade deal. Boring.
Yeah. Well, 2 weeks into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, India accidentally lobbed a cruise missile at Pakistan, and nothing happened. And and that kind of
I didn't
nobody
even hear
noticed.
That. That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was actually a New York Times article which I found by accident because you had to scroll through 18 iPhone pages of news about Ukraine before you could find anything else about the rest of the world. And so even when we do write articles about them, we don't write as many, and then we don't really read them. So there is an availability bias, but there's a kind of an obsession with that gruesome event that's actually happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And also your point is that it's not that people are not fighting because they're actually nicer inside than we used to give humans credit for. But in fact, like these gang members, they may want to just beat the crap out of each other. They may hate each other on some deep level, but they don't act on it because they do the calculation. Like, well, what will be the cost if we actually turn to violence? And it's not worth it. I'll suppress my anger. I'll count to 10. I'll wait for the 2 marshmallows instead of taking the 1 marshmallow now. I'll delay gratification for what I really want. So they do have some element of self-control there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is if, human societies over time have actually been really good at inculcating norms of cooperation and providing lots of incentives to not fight, and you can think of a lot of what's happened over the last few hundred years as like a domestication of ourselves, in the sense that we, why don't I want the American government to go and invade insert country here? Well, it's because I do have some empathy for them, right? And I probably have more empathy for them than one of my ancestors would have had for that same faraway peoples a couple hundred years ago. So if we do that successfully, then we actually make us we build in all this padding and we make this a more peaceful world. But my point is, and so that's great, and we should do lots of that, and I'm happy as much of it has happened as it has. But I guess the point of the basic like strategic insight that we get from that you've just pointed out is we actually don't need that. That's not necessary for peace. That there's this huge incentive, even if I don't care about the other person at all, zero, right? They can live or die. It's still war. It's going to be costly to me. I don't care if it's costly to them, but it's costly to me. It's costly to my group, and that's a serious disincentive. Now, more disincentives are better, and that's what empathy and lots of other things give us. But they're not necessary, I guess, is the good news.
Yeah. So give us some examples of smaller conflicts. So you're defining war as a group conflict. So you're not dealing with homicides here and just one-on-one or conflicts, or to use a current example of a Will Smith gets mad and walks up and slaps Chris Rock because he just lost his cool there. But you're talking about groups, so gangs. Just start small with like local gangs in Chicago or Medellin. Why do they fight and why do they not fight sometimes?
Yeah, and that's kind of how I came to writing this book. Was I would study villages in Liberia or ethnic factions in East Africa or gangs in Chicago, gangs in Medellin, and I saw a lot of the same dynamics, and all of this theory and these ideas that I learned for intergroup conflict seemed to make a lot of sense and be appearing, and a lot of the things that worked at a local level had parallels in what worked at an international level, and they could learn a lot from one another. Chicago in some ways is a bad example. I mean, there is a considerable amount of violence in Chicago right now. Most people know this. We don't have the highest homicide rate in the country, not even by a long shot, but it's pretty high. It's but a range of 30 per 100,000, which is high by any standard. A lot of that is targeted assassinations between members of, I wouldn't even call them, the reason it's a bad example is I wouldn't even call them gangs per se. I've been doing some work in Chicago on a lot of this violence. I'd say a lot of it is quite individualistic. The days of well-organized gangs are somewhat over. So some of the guys I know and work with who are now social workers and peacemakers, but 30 years ago were local gang leaders, real gang leaders, talk about just how disorganized Chicago is, how it's based. They'll say these aren't gangs, these are mobs, these are cliques or cliques. That term is meant to sort of confer. It's just like a loose association of a few guys who live on the same block, and they're kind of out for themselves. They're not really operating strategically as small groups, and so a lot of the targeted killings are essentially, they're a little bit more like feuds between clans and feuds between just families. In the sense that there's a lot of retributive killings. There's maybe a little bit of turf war over this drug corner, that drug corner, but it might just be the individual defense of a drug corner. So one guy I've worked with and talked to who's an active drug dealer talks about how, he doesn't, he sort of says, he sort of described himself today, he's kind of a monster. He's very quick to be violent and he wants to change that. But the way he talked about that coming about was very strategic. He said, I was weak and I was trying to sell drugs and someone was muscling in on my corner. And I thought, I'm just going to have to be really badass otherwise they're going to take everything from me. They're going to rob me. They're going to take my corners. So I'm going to have to kill him. And so he killed strategically to send a message. So there's some parallels there to what groups and nations do. But I think, but with individuals, there's a little bit more going on. So I don't love to use Chicago as an example of group violence, but a better example is in Medellin, Colombia, where the gangs are much more organized and the leadership structures are there. So the reason that doesn't exist anymore in Chicago is largely because the U.S. government has systematically cut off the heads of every organization for 20 years as a deliberate strategy of weakening them, and that's worked, but it's also led to sort of disorganized violence that nobody can really control. Because it's so individualized.
Right.
That hasn't happened in Medellin, where you have much more organized gangs who organize their own little version of the UN Security Council that really collaborate to stop the violence in their city because it's so costly.
Right. Well, some of those bigger gangs and drug running organizations are like corporations. So that's
Yeah.
very different than the Chicago situation. Let me just give you the kind of the simplistic libertarian perspective on that. If drugs were legal and
Hmm.
regulated, then there wouldn't be a black market. There'd just be a free market. And then that would reduce the amount of gang violence because there's nothing to fight over. The guy on the corner says, well, you're encroaching on my territory. Well, they have a contract if it's legal, and then you take it to court or whatever. And since it's illegal, there's no court to go to. You can't call the police. So you have to take the law into your own hands. Self-help justice.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen, I mean, I don't, that might also be libertarian. I think that's just a very straightforward political economic view of the world that, that is true, that we don't legalize drugs partly because they have some bad consequences. At least some drugs do. And it's politic. And so people are just intransigent. They just say, there's nothing, it's just repugnant to legalize these things. And which is totally understandable. I get that. And the cost is that whenever you make something illegal that's heavily demanded, you create a space for illegal organizations. It's the same as if I tax something too heavily, like cigarettes in Canada. That led to a huge black market for American cigarettes that were smuggled across, the reservations of Indigenous Canadians. And so as soon as you outlaw something that's demanded, you're going to create this space for these organizations. If you hadn't outlawed it, there might be other deleterious consequences, but you wouldn't have seen these organizations emerge. Now, the worst situations where you outlaw it, create these organizations, change your mind, legalize it, but now these organizations are established and have an ongoing incentive to exist. So that's what Prohibition did with alcohol. And it took generations to reduce the strength of the mob, but they still exist today. And so that's why I think legalization in Latin America, even if you could argue there are merits to that argument, I'm undecided, to be completely honest. Even if you decided it was the right thing to do beforehand to avoid the rise of these groups, the thing is they exist. And I'm not sure you're going to outcompete them with the legal sector completely, or they'll just find something else to do. And it might be politics. So I'm not sure what the best path is now that we're in this second or third best world where these armed organizations exist and are very powerful, have a lot of money, and are very organized.
Right. But after Prohibition was abolished and major corporations got into the business of making beer and wine and spirits, bootleggers just could not compete. You can't compete with a billion-dollar
Right.
corporation that makes all this stuff. So they just fell out of use. They had to find something else.
But they moved into other markets, right? So
Mm,
they moved
mm,
into labor racketeering more, and they moved
right.
into sports betting, and they moved into all sorts of other now, and they moved into drugs eventually. Now, most of the things they moved into eventually also got outcompeted by something. So state lotteries outcompeted numbers games, and labor racketeering was less useful once with the decline of unions and so forth. So that's one story for the decline of the mob. Is it's not just better law enforcement and the invention of innovative strategies for prosecuting people like what we call RICO and so forth, but rather it's just they got outcompeted by legitimate things or the sources of the revenues, and then they were slow to adopt the selling of drugs compared to other groups. So but still that was generations, like 60, 70 years of a lot of mob strength, and they're not irrelevant today. And so we can partly, we owe that to Prohibition, and so assuming if cocaine was like alcohol and had the same level of deleterious consequences for society, then it would probably make a lot of sense to legalize, and then we'd just have to expect it will be a century before these cartels are really weak. But it's tricky because cocaine isn't as deleterious as alcohol. It seems to be worse, I think. I'm not a doctor or an expert or social expert on this, but so that makes it a very difficult trade-off.
Yeah, just for fun, the other day I looked up the addiction and death rate from opioids because I was curious. I just had a major surgery, and the doctor gave me some hydrocodone, which is an opioid. And it's like, you get this one prescription and that's it. We're not refilling it. And by the way, you have to have it in person, in writing. We can't do it online anymore. And we don't fill them on the weekends. And they gave me this sheet of all the regulations because of the opioid crisis. Well, it's about 10%, according to the CDC, it's about 10% that have serious addictive and then medical or death issues with. So if you have two bins, you got the 90% bin of 90% of people who take opioids have no problems at all with them. And then you got the 10% bin, but the 10% gets all the media attention. And the law of large numbers, if you have, 50 million people take opioids for various chronic pain issues and whatnot, that's enough to fill the evening news every day with somebody who died of an overdose. So then somebody says, well, somebody should do something. That's what the government should do, regulate this, and they have. But still, it's like, I feel like maybe that's some overreach.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I would say, like, the thing that is tricky about some of these drugs is that there's some. So let's say there's there's a legitimate recreational or medical use of a drug. Could be cocaine, could be opiates. But then there's some probability, even small, that if you try it, that you'll have this addictive reaction to it. Either biologically or whatever, the way you're cultured, something about you or your circumstances in that moment. That has like really bad sort of knock-on effects for anybody who falls into that. It has really bad knock-on effects for everyone around them. It has really bad knock-on effects for the public, the wider sort of whole set of things in the public sphere. So the question I don't know is, like, if we legalize, so now, then it happens in secret, right? And the price is probably higher because it's illegal. So when it's illegal, maybe it's harder to obtain them. Price is higher. There's lots of things. Maybe that actually leads to fewer people getting addicted. Like that's a kind of public policy trade-off where I haven't sort of seen through all the implications. I guess I can imagine a world where if legalization, if keeping it illegal actually really reduces that probability of people sort of getting these follow-on addictions and creating all of these sort of negative impacts for themselves, their families, society, then it might be the right trade-off. But in the end, the sad thing is it's just sort of like saying, who's going to pay the price? Are we going to let Colombians have their economy or their villages or their politics completely hijacked, and Mexicans have essentially be a quasi-failed state? Because we don't want more of our children to get addicted. That's the problem, is that, like, by saying we don't want that here in the United States, for example, we're not bearing a lot of the costs of then the people that shifts the burden of illegality, right? That price is paid in Colombia and Peru and Ecuador and Mexico. And so that,
although in this case, I guess the Sackler family and Purdue Pharmaceutical are going to have to pay some price for that, but it's probably not enough. And when I try to see it from my doctor's point of view, I pitched her and I gave her the little Bayesian reasoning, the 90% bin, the 10% bin. I walk in the door, you don't know anything about me. Which bin am I most likely to be in? If you hear hoof prints outside the door, think horse, not zebra, and so on. But from her perspective, she doesn't know which one I am. And if she has 100 patients that she gives the script to for hydrocodone, 10 of them are going to have a serious issue. And then one of their family lawyers is going to come after her. So it's better to just say, we're going to follow the restrictions because it's safer for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, and that might be right. I mean, that might be the quality. I've read somewhere a couple of recent interesting NBR papers, this National Bureau of Economic Research, on this and trying to put some numbers. And I think like the median opioid addict is like a 45-year-old housewife or something like that. So there's a lot of, it's not that you're like a bad person and you have this reaction. And I know I'm not a bad person, doctor, and you can tell like an upstanding citizen. I think maybe she might be right. Like maybe it really is like, actually, it's really hard to tell. It's a lot of unobservables, and it could be you. And that's a really unfortunate. That's a really unfortunate thing.
Yes. Well, because a lot of people do have chronic pain, and now maybe they can't get the painkillers they need, and most of them will be fine. But but the 10%, that's a lot, actually. With the law of large numbers, if you have 100 million people, 10%, that's a lot. Yeah. So, okay. Just to put some numbers on this, because you mentioned, 5 out of 5 per 100 or 30 per 100,000. In the United States, what's the average? 5 per 100,000 for the entire country. In Europe, it's like 1 per 100,000. We're talking about homicides here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Steve Pinker famously, tracked all this in The Better Angels of Our Nature from other people's data sets, showing that, the decline of homicide has been pretty steady over the centuries. And, 1 out of per 100,000 in Europe. It's 5 here. Why? Because we have so many guns and gangs and things like that, and a gun-happy culture? Or how do you think about violence, say, in these United States versus Canada, Europe, whatever?
Yeah. So I will say like that, this kind of let's call this interpersonal violence, because it's like homicides. It's me killing you. It's me killing my wife. It's not two groups going to war. Very seldom in the United States is our homicide rate driven by organized groups. So, which is partly just to say, like, I think I know a lot more about organized groups than I know how to explain homicide rates in Americas versus the rest of the world. I think it is interesting just how different all of the Americas are in terms of higher homicide rates in comparison to most other parts of the world. And so I think it's actually a little bit of a puzzle, and we don't have great answers. I would say one answer that I think distinguishes us from some parts of the world is that I think I think the state, and I think this is something that Pinker argues, this is something lots of social scientists argue, is that the state can influence violence, not just through policing, but through gun control, through all sorts of mechanisms. And we just actually have slightly less state presence, I think, than we have somewhat less state presence in these areas than Europe and in a lot of Asian countries. So that could be part of the answer, whether that's police per capita, whether that's gun control, etc. I think another part of the answer is there may just be some people would call it a culture of honor, or merely just a set of social norms about how do you respond to provocations and what's an appropriate response. And so I think there's some truth probably to the idea that that whether or not I respond to an affront with a gun and a shooting isn't partly a social norm, right? What's the appropriate response to a provocation or unjust act or a slight? And so I do think there might be a problem of social norms across the Americas, where somehow we sort of see this as like the appropriate response, or at least the response that we observe others partaking in, and so it has a certain self-sustaining quality to it. And that might have emerged because of less historical state presence and maybe even slightly contemporary less state presence. So I think that there's how much explanatory power do I give those? I don't know. Is that 40% of the explanation? I don't know. I don't think it's the whole explanation. And the rest is kind of a mystery to me. But I think those two get us pretty far. But if I sort of wanted to I don't know, say what I thought would be a great frontier of sociology and economics and political science over the next 10 years, that would, better answers there would be fabulous.
Yeah, well, I guess the idea is that democracy came later to the southern states than the New England states. Mm-hmm. The rates of violence are higher there because they have to cultivate a culture of honor to settle their own disputes, because the courts were not there for them, or in the West as well. The long arm of the law took a long time to get out there, so they had to set up their own little rules and regulations and way to settle disputes, and that's usually involving more violence than if the state had a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And I think that's the explanation. Also, that Richard Nisbett had this theory of that kind of psychology of the culture of honor, of who populated the South versus who populated the New England states from Europe, and that the people in the South came from regions where they did have to cultivate a culture of honor to protect their, I think it was their ranches or their herds of animals or whatever. And because I think it was ranchers who didn't have fences, so they had to defend their property through this kind of informal culture of honor. Anyway, it's an interesting.
So I think story. I think there's that helps give us a context, I think, where we maybe have social norms in this equilibrium where we are more likely to want to use violence, and then more likely to use lethal violence, and more likely to use a gun. and that interacts with an absence of gun control. But I mean, another way to put this, though, and I think this is really important, is at the end of the day, Chicago's high homicide rate is of 30 per 100,000. Basically, there were roughly 800 murders last year. And I think there were, I forget the exact statistic. Let's say there were actually 3,000 or 4,000 shootings. So 800 of these are lethal. The rest are not. Let's suppose most of them were intended to be lethal. That meant less than 4,000 people pulled the trigger. And probably, let's say it's 3,000, because some people pulled the trigger. Maybe it was just 2,000. So, our homicide problem is thus partly this thing, it's the state, it's policing, it's norms. It seems hard to change, and that's partly true. But another way to look at it is that we see a lot of variation across U.S. cities, and we all have very similar states and police and norms. Some of us sort of are better at figuring out how to handle those 2,000 trigger pullers than others, right? Either with carrots or with sticks. And so, I think at the end of the day, the right way to think about a lot of homicide policy and violence, this individualized homicide violence policy, is to think about this as a problem in a city like Chicago of 2,000 individuals, which might mean, or let's say we say, it's hard to predict, and a lot of people might have pulled the trigger, but, because a butterfly flapped its wings and blah, blah, blah. So maybe it's a problem with 5,000 individuals. That's a really different way to define the problem. And you get different solutions. And then I think there's a bunch of tools that are out there that actually really work with 5,000 people. So in some ways, the answer to your question is there's been an unwillingness to use and experiment with tools that work better at that level, that we're too obsessed with thinking about big solutions to big issues, and instead of thinking of this as like a very targeted problem. And I will say, like, the one big change at the national level, whether it's the Biden administration or many cities, Republican, Democrat, is more and more mayors are looking at the problem this way, and they're thinking about new ways to do it in addition to policing, and that involve social services, that involve what they call outreach and violence interruption, all these sorts of things. And I think that makes me optimistic about gun violence in American cities.
So if I follow this, let's just take the entire outline of the city of Chicago, which is fairly sizable. It's not that the 800 homicides are evenly distributed as dots across this entire city. They're targeted and specific, like at that street corner right there where these two gangs are active. That's where we should put more police, because that's where, 80% of it's like a power law, 80% of the crimes happen in 20% of the area. Something like that.
Yeah. And I think of it less mechanistically. I've never been that sort of sympathetic to the power law story. It's more to me that, like, anything a small number is going to be concentrated in people. It's probably concentrated in space. So the social norms of using violence are larger in some parts of Chicago, and the legitimacy of the state is lower in some parts of the Chicago for obvious reasons, right? So Black Americans in Chicago have very little reason to trust the state. The state has given them historically very few reasons to do so. So if you wanted to settle a dispute, you probably had to do it through a community mechanism or yourself, especially if you're in an illicit organization, when you can't turn to a community organization, you can't turn to the state. And so that's why a lot of these homicides are just targeted assassinations between members of people who are at least part-time engaging in illicit activities in neighborhoods where there is policing, but it's not very legitimate in a historical sense. And so these two things interact. And so you can target those corners of those people with police, and that's one strategy. Chicago's been doing it. One of the things we've been working on is showing that you can target them with a job and cognitive behavior therapy, and not target all of the south side of Chicago with jobs. That might be a good thing for other reasons, but actually to find these 2,000 people and say, here's a path to a different life, and we're going to give you skills, and we're also going to give you the soft skills and the practice and some of the counseling and things that you will need to actually overcome some very real barriers you have to operating as like a normal citizen in normal society. And that's something I ran as randomized control trials in in West Africa with ex-rebels and street youth, and that's something we're running now here as a randomized controlled trial in Chicago, and other people have done elsewhere, and it seems to be one of the most successful things we have to reduce killing.
Yeah, I just had Adam Levin on the podcast. He has this book called Swiped. He studies and actively engaged in phishing scams and fraudsters and con artists and so on. And what became clear is that, these are rational actors. Because I said, why are they doing this? Well, I mean, the amount of effort they put into it, if they had a career, wouldn't they be more successful? And he said, in many cases, no, they can make a lot more money. Just sitting there 8 hours a day calling, randomly calling people with the latest IRS scam or whatever, they can be pretty successful. So if we treat them as rational actors or economic, kind of like homo economicus, then what could the government do, or state, local governments, along the lines of, here's a job that pays $15 an hour. Well, yeah, dude, I can make $500 an hour doing this other thing.
Yeah. So I think in a context where you're trying to give people an incentive out of a really highly paid career, that's going to be hard. Now, it might be that if there's danger associated with that career or a lack of status, then maybe they'll take a lower paying job. I guess the fortunate thing for us, at least in the city of Chicago, this isn't true everywhere. It's not true in Columbia where I work. But in Chicago, at least, this drug dealing doesn't really pay anymore. You make decent money. Some people make a lot of money and they're not interested, but most people are not making that much money. It's very competitive. Prices are much lower than they used to be, probably because there's less organized crime control. There's less coordination. And so they're all out there eking out a living. It's not very high status. It's very dangerous. And so most people, not all, but a large proportion, are really interested in a way out. And so when the outreach workers we work with go out and track down somebody who people know is very likely to shoot someone, whether that's based on the community knowledge and what's just happened in the last week, or whether it's a function of some of your recent arrests and activities, say like way more than probably half to 2/3 take up the offer, which is pretty high, right? That's higher than I anticipated. We didn't know what would happen. 10%, 100%.
And is that because most of the spoils go to the handful of people at the top of the gang or the criminal ring, and the rest of
there's no ring, right? It's like a supply chain. Everybody's taking their cut, right? At the retail level, if it's competitive, there aren't that many sort of rents to be earned there. It's because, if somebody's will always sell a little bit lower than you on the next corner, this is the function of this sort of disorganized, sort of leaderless set of mobs and cliques. There is no organized collective. There is no even gang for the neighborhood in Chicago at present, right? And except in maybe a few neighborhoods. And so nobody's fixing the market to charge higher prices. Not true in Medellin. Medellin, they manage a very sophisticated price cartel in the classic sense of a cartel, right? They're not one organization. There's 400 organizations coordinated by about 17 mafia-like organizations. So 400 street gangs coordinated by about 17 mafia-like organizations, which themselves sort of have two blocks, and they have their own little board called the table, la mesa, or the office, la oficina. And they very effectively are charging monopolistic prices, way above the competitive price. They're all coordinating to basically, get the maximum they can. And gang members in Medellin earn a lot of money. Though some 22-year-old who's like a middle manager in one of these organizations is earning, as much as somebody who's at he's earning more than 80% of the other, citizens of Medellin. And this is a pretty rich city, right? This is a city, with $20,000 per person purchasing power parity income. So about half of U.S. city America, in terms of wealth. Yeah. So they're doing well for themselves. That's a very hard place to entice them out of those groups. And I predict what we're doing in Chicago wouldn't make any difference at all. Right.
Give us some idea of what it's like to engage with these people, study them? I mean, you show up with your clipboard and go, "Hi, I'm a professor from the University of Chicago, and I want to figure out what you're doing here," and then they tell you to get lost, or how do you get through to that?
It's always been a process of trial and error. So in each place, so typically I've only worked in 2 or 3 places, and I worked for 5 years intensively in Uganda and during the war, and I worked for 5 years really intensively in Liberia, and then I worked for 5 years very intensively in Medellin, and I'm just starting a 5-year I'm in the middle of a 5-year escapade in Chicago, and so partly you just have to really be dedicated to a place and not have lots of research sites, and partly you just have to you find local experts, gang members who've gone legitimate, or local professors, or local community organizers, and NGO leaders and things, and then you just prepare to strike out, talking to these criminal organizations until you find a way in. In Chicago, it was through this sort of army of what they call outreach workers, who are ex-gang members who are my age, and 30 years ago were like these young men on the streets, but are now basically social workers. So it's very easy to work through them and understand how things work and get them to introduce you through their credibility. That didn't exist in Medellin, so we struck out again and again. We discovered by accident that nobody would talk to us. They were all too scared. But if we went in with our clipboards to a prison, they would talk to us. The leaders would, because we sort of discovered by accident one day, all these prisons have a leaders wing. So we're leaving after sort of striking out, talking to some of the lower level gang members in the prison. And the warden says, "Oh, would you like to go to the leaders wing?" We were like, "Of course we would." So she puts out an announcement. Does anyone want to talk to these sort of professors? And 5 guys showed up. And one of them stormed out immediately, and the others were actually really interested in what we had to say and interested in answering our questions for lots of reasons. And that kind of snowballed into contacts with 30 organizations. Because these guys were self-assured. They didn't have to worry about anyone hitting them because they were talking to somebody, and they'd been prosecuted, and so they could tell us almost anything, because there's no double jeopardy in Colombia. And they were kind of hoped we would write a book about them, right? They like the idea, and they seek legitimacy as well. So there's lots of reasons. It varies by place, and we have to be careful because we don't want to legitimize these actors in a problematic way. So we're always very careful how we operate. But yeah, so it's but slow, and it's rewarding.
So you must have had to protect but they must have had to protect some of their sources still on the outside, like not naming names, because then they'd probably get whacked in the prison. So they must have been speaking more in generalities. Maybe a certain sense of pride, like, yeah, we made a lot of money and here's how I did it.
So there's a sense of that. There's a sense that they're secure enough that they can talk to others. I'm also asking about their internal wage structure. I'm not, anyone's they don't even know why I'm interested in the wage structure of a gang. But actually, if you want to fight a gang, you better understand their wage structure, right? How are you going to entice people out of an armed group if you don't even understand what they're getting paid and how? So, and we're very transparent with them. But at least it varies from place to place. Often people just like talking about their work, and nobody asks them. And nobody who's high status, and they sort of think of a professor as high status, both the Colombian professors that I work with and the American professors. And they like the idea of a book, but in Colombia they also seek they're very frustrated because they're like nobody understands how strong we are. It's really hard. They're sort of saying, we're trying to bargain with the government. We want a better deal. I want less prison time. I can keep the city peaceful, and we can have less killing, and I want to make my money in peace, and I just want a little less prison time, or I just want you to stop doing this or that. And their frustration is that these mayoral administrations and the police chief turns over every 2, 3, 4 years. And it's super frustrating because nobody understands how strong they are. And at least you guys understand how strong we are. And so can you please tell them? And so, what they're saying that uncertainty, one of our 5 factors, is a source of conflict. The government keeps attacking us because they underestimate our strength and they overestimate their strength. And this is inefficient. We shouldn't be fighting. So you guys are going to go and inform everybody how strong we are. and you're going to stop the fighting. And so that's like a morally complicated position for us to be in. So we have to be careful. But at the same time, like resolving asymmetric information and like actually helping everybody choose a better path, because helping the government actually understand what are the strengths of these criminal organizations is important. And on top of that, and this is something we're very transparent about with these organized criminal groups, is like, and we're going to help them shrink your business. And so at the same time that we're trying to help the government make better choices in terms of not underestimate these groups, we're also trying to help them understand them better so that they choose better policies and actually don't stop doing the stuff that isn't working and do more stuff that might work.
This is like the stories of the mafiosos who after The Godfather came out, really liked the movie because it kind of romanticized what they did. Yeah, I'm like Don Corleone. Yeah. We have our own moral system and a code of honor amongst thieves and so on and boasting. We're not communists here.
Yeah. I mean, you do have to wake up in the morning and feel like you're a good person. It doesn't matter who you are. And so they do have like a moral rationalization for what they do. I'm always fascinated. This isn't my main research, but I'm always curious at like, what's their narrative for convincing themselves that what they do is the right thing? So one of the reasons, actually, and related to that, one of the reasons that when I run these programs or help design these programs, so I don't run them, but I help design a lot of these programs. But when I design or promote these programs, and then I'm to say, get these guys off the street, stop them from being killers, give them a job. Usually, that means what the Chicago program is called the Ready program. What it's doing is it's actually trying to go to this group and whoever they have who's their shooter, who sometimes is a valued member of the team, loose and disorganized as that team might be, we're saying we're getting rid of their shooters, right? And so I kind of wondered one day, I met this gang leader and we jumped out of the car with one of these outreach workers because we were tracking down somebody else for the program. And the leader happened to be there. And we were chatting while the outreach workers were doing their business. And in front of an ice cream and nacho truck, which is something I didn't know existed. And I asked him, like, why are you happy that we are helping? Like, why are you being supportive of this? I'm just curious. And he's like, oh, I'm only doing this for the guys. Like, I gotta, to the extent that he was orchestrating some of the stuff in that mob, he's like, we're just trying to keep busy. And what you're offering them is better, right? What you're offering them is much better than what I can offer them. And so I'm super happy you're doing this. And that's very common. I found that again and again. Anytime I've worked on like a reintegration program, whether it's rebel combatants or Chicago gang members or something, a lot of the time the leaders are not threatened. They're like, listen, we're just trying to help one another here, and you're doing a good job with them. So I'm all the power to you. And plus, there's 400 other guys where he came from. So it's not like I face like inelastic labor supply. That guy can easily be replaced.
Yeah, that reminded me of Pablo. Was it Pablo Escobar that had so much money? Yep. He funded local schools and took care of the poor people. It had like a welfare program for the city, and he was like a real political leader. He was buying
legitimacy. Yeah, he was doing what these other guys are doing. They still do it today. They're not as organized as Pablo, and they don't have as much money, but they try to protect their position by fostering loyalty and legitimacy, and they do that by behaving a little bit like states. It's a very common phenomenon throughout the Americas.
Right. Or in Somalia, which is largely stateless, you have those pirates operating. They're just watching that Captain Phillips movie again the other day.
Right.
They tried to give a little bit of perspective. Why are they doing this? Well, they're poor. That's why. And, they can get some ransom money. It's worth the risk, kind of a calculation. So back to where we began with your background in international development. Would it be good then for somebody like the United States to give development money to Somalia or help their government get structured to prevent that sort of gang activity?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, but I would sort of make the same point that I sort of said that I'd make to like the mayor of Chicago, which is to say, like, if you're trying to stop violence, whether it's mobs and cliques and targeted assassinations in Chicago, or you're trying to stop Somali pirates, it's probably a very targeted problem, right? In the sense that there's only so many operators, and so often the problem is someone will say, oh, we need like more jobs on the south side of Chicago, or we need more jobs in Somalia. We need to develop Somalia. We need to develop the south side of Chicago. Now, there's lots of good reasons to try to contribute to those things if it's possible. But violence prevention isn't one of them, right? Because chances are, there's whatever, there's the 2 million people you were to help in an extremely successful program, maybe 5 of them are actually members of this illicit group. So I think the rule with a lot of violence reduction programs is it has to look at the set of individuals and leaders who are actually partaking in this. If it's organized violence, and you have to be very focused on the groups and the leaders of those groups. And then you have to think very carefully about their incentives, their strategic incentives. You have to think, and if you're trying to stop violence between groups, you have to actually try to diagnose what are these 5 sources of breakdown, which of the 5 are actually present here, and how are they manifesting in the specific scenario, and then which set of tools do I have that maps that to that thing? Which, if this were a doctor, that would be totally natural. If someone would say, well, the doctor has to like figure out what the specific, first they have to figure out what the disease is, and then they should have a treatment that's tailored to that disease. And they're going to have to spend a lot of time on diagnosis, because otherwise, whatever they do is useless. We don't take that same instinctual approach to a lot of international aid or to a lot of just policy towards parts of our own cities, which is to say, let's actually figure out what the specific, we know there's some principles of disease, we know there's some diseases, let's actually figure out what the specific disease are. Like, let's actually figure out what is the particular cause of violence between these organized groups, and let's solve some of those bargaining problems so that we can get them back to the normal business of just loathing one another in peace.
Loathing one another in peace. That's a great line.
That's the grand dream here. We can aim for universal like brotherhood and sisterhood, but actually violence reduction is much simpler than that. It's just help people loathe in peace.
Yeah. So before the time gets away from us, because we're coming up on an hour and a half here, let's go through your 10 commandments at the end of the book about how to achieve paths to peace. Number 1 is thou shalt judge the easy from the wicked. So I'll just let you kind of riff on these however long you like.
So, I mean, the first thing I want is I didn't want to end the book with like some optimistic, the world can be more. I didn't know how am I going to do this, and I didn't want to just give a list of policies, because I don't think we know the right policies. I think I wanted to sort of set out with a general set of principles that have proven to like help people solve really hard problems, whether it's violence or not. And that's and the first one is sort of to say, like, one of the classic mistakes that people make over and over and over and over and over again in every realm of human policy and choices is to sort of think a problem is simple to solve when it's to recognize that there's really simple problems and there's really complex problems, and that they have certain characteristics, and not and to recognize that when we go to another place in the world that's foreign to us, and that could be me on the south side of Chicago, which in some ways is pretty foreign, or it could be me in Somalia, is to recognize that I have like an innate tendency to oversimplify the situation and overprivilege simple solutions that also happen to, use the tools I have. And so in some sense, the first commandment is to sort of be aware that this is an innate bias, just like we have an availability bias, and therefore let's try to make that mistake less.
Okay, number 2, we have thou shalt not worship grand plans and best practices. I think you've covered that already. No big grand theories are going to explain it. You got to get on the ground and look at each particular one. Right. Oh yeah, I want to ask you about the Truth and Reconciliation commissions. Do those work? And we can think of it in the American context of reparations or the 1619 Project. We're in the middle of this national conversation about. We have not really had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for America's sins.
Yeah, so it's like a natural. By oversimplifying solutions and oversimplifying the problem, we then try to think, we need reparations. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We need this. We need that. And I remember the story I tell in the book is about somebody showing up in northern Uganda for the first day and sort of jumping to the conclusion that this thing that he did was the obvious solution to the problem, and that's all they needed. And they call these best practices, and we kind of think, best practice, we must all, And my point is that very seldom best practices work for the simple problems, like how to vaccinate kids for measles, right? Simple problem, best practices work well. As soon as you have a very complicated problem, and what some people call wicked problems, best practices don't exist. And so you have to just recognize that best practices only work for simple problems, and violence is not a simple problem.
All
And so truth and
policy making is
reconciliation
political. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, no, I would just say I think truth and reconciliation commissions, I think, work when there's are not very good at violence reduction, right? Because South Africa, where the first popular one emerged, wasn't even a violent place, right? It was a place to sort of build more social harmony. So it wasn't even designed as a solution to violence. So maybe it could be an ingredient, but in general, I just don't think it's misused.
Yeah. Okay, all policy making is political. Every rule and every intervention changes the balance of power. Okay, there's your game theory calculation.
Right. Well, it's also recognizes not people don't just when you go and you as a policymaker you start to decide what should we do in Somalia or something. Not usually like, oh, I'm the impartial policymaker and whatever I do is like I'm just trying to achieve the most good. But you're actually a political actor and you're probably shifting. You're bringing your own biases first of all, but you're also shifting. You're trying to empower the state usually versus other groups. You're actually trying to change the balance of power in that society. Do so with open eyes and then understand that you will be seen as a agent of the state as a result and there's just sort of just to resist this other bias to sort of think that you're somehow quote unquote impartial.
All right, let me just skip around here. Find the right path by exploring many paths. So there's
that's
maybe
a little
not
bit
just
like right
one
where
right
we
path.
began.
Yeah,
Which is to say, like, as a general principle to so I said, well, I needed to find you gave me a wicked problem, which is how do you find what you love in the world to do for the rest of your life? Right? That's a wicked problem.
Yeah.
And you need trial and error. I engaged in a process of trial and error. How do I find a solution to violence in Chicago? Well, there's no simple solution, and if there's no simple solution and there's no best practice, then I'm only going to discover that through humble trial and error. And so so it's just a general principle for approaching wicked problems that happens to be incredibly important for approaching conflict and violence.
Right. So therefore, number 7, thou shalt be patient. It takes time.
Yeah, I mean the number of reports you will hear coming out saying we will reduce the murder rate by half in 5 years, or we will cut corruption or end violence in Sudan in 5 years. When this is just any successful effort will take decades.
Right. So therefore, 8, set sensible goals, and B, number 9, accountable. Thou shalt be accountable. You mean for the decisions you make, policy decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's how do you incentivize trial and error? How do you make policymakers how do we as those of us who have power in this society, like I have this ability because of my position to like influence what gets done in poor neighborhoods in Chicago. Who's to say I'm not going to make a mistake or stumble upon something that I believe that just doesn't happen to be true or that benefits me in some way, even if it's just through esteem, and just stick with that? Well, I mean, generally every society I think that has sort of like continually made better choices and had good policy has sort of made all of its decision makers accountable, which is kind of a theme that runs through the whole book. Like the whole reason we have conflict is because of a lack of accountability, and a lack of like unchecked leaders is not just a way that people ignore the costs of war, but it means they're more susceptible to these intangible incentives like glory. We're more susceptible to their idiosyncratic misperceptions. There's more uncertainty. It's harder to make commitments with autocrats because they're accountable to nobody. So like a lack of accountability to me is like the fundamental problem in the world that's underneath violence, and it also happens to be underneath really bad decision making and low growth and poorly run cities like so much Chicago. And so in some sense it's like a meta theme in a lot of my work, and is everything's about a lack of accountability, and we just need more checked and balanced societies, and that'll make us all a bit better, including
Yeah, well,
Vladimir Putin's Russia.
yes, I was going to say let's just wrap it up there because Biden just yesterday, we're recording this on April 5th, said this is a war criminal and he should be held accountable. Like we're going to haul him into the Hague. Well, good luck with that. How do you get him?
Yeah.
And I agree. I mean, that's the right sentiment. But one of these documentaries I was binge watching on Putin. I think it was the Frontline episode, Putin's War, where they tracked back to where he watched the videos of who's the mad dog of the Middle East, the guy that was darn.
I don't know, Gaddafi?
Oh, the guy that,
or
yeah, Gaddafi. Sorry, I just spaced out there.
All right.
Right. Where Gaddafi's hauled out and drug along by his feet and pissed on and hit and strung up and Putin apparently watched this and said, this will never happen to me. And so the idea of the West saying, we're going to track you down and put you in the Hague and try you for war crimes, like, I don't know if this is it's a good strategy move for somebody like him.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of, whenever there's an active ongoing conflict, whatever we do, there's a choice between holding the current leader accountable, even if it means continued war, and incentivizing them to keep fighting, because the alternative looks pretty ugly. But that sends a signal to every future person who would cross this line in future. Or compromising and letting them get away with bad stuff because they're strong, and doing what Sun Tzu told us to do, which is to build a golden bridge for your enemy to retreat along. So there's this tension. We could stop this war potentially by not saying we're going to prosecute you no matter what, but saying stop now or we're going to make this worse. And we've changed that strategy to be more punitive. And I can understand that. I hope it's a calculated one that says we need to do this to assure a more peaceful world tomorrow, even if it comes at the sacrifice of Ukrainian lives today. It would be a shame if that's a tricky calculus to make. It would be a shame if we're making that decision without even thinking through it.
Right. Yeah, so let's just play this out for a second. Let's say he annexes that eastern Donbass region with those two separatist groups and says, I won. This is all I wanted in the first place. I'm going to take the troops back. And then a year later, he wants to show up at the G8 meeting and go to Davos and meet with the European Union leaders and become active member of the UN and on and on. He wants to call the president of the United States and have a conversation. How do we ever let him back into the community of nations now after this has happened?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I think to me, that kind of stalemate is maybe the most likely outcome right now. First of all, the stalemate where there's no formal agreement where Ukraine recognizes that Russia controls this region and Crimea but maybe some concessions are made to Russia in terms of neutrality, and then that region just becomes this eternally disputed occupied region like Kashmir. And it's never quite resolved, but it's never quite violent, right? There'll be little skirmishes. So we might, until he's gone or until there's a regime change or something, maybe longer, for the next 30 years, there's a new Kashmir. But it'll be mostly peaceful because it doesn't make sense to fight, even if one side lobs a cruise missile at the other. So I think that is the most likely outcome. Whether or not that's the outcome, we have to have normal relations with Russia because it's so powerful in some fashion. Demonizing and saying the leader has to go has generally never worked. It didn't work in Sudan. It didn't work in Cuba. It didn't work in Venezuela. It's so not a successful strategy for regime change, I think. And leaders are walking themselves into a place where it's going to be very difficult to have normal relations with Russia. So either it won't happen or it'll happen in secret. I don't know. And so I don't know. Again, it's this tension between having principles and deterring future leaders from doing things, and also trying to have a more peaceful, functioning world today, given that he's probably still going to be president for the next 20 years. So, and that's just there's nobody will be happy. Whatever trade-off we choose, most people are going to be unhappy with it for different reasons. And so, but that's kind of this really uneasy, uncomfortable world I think we might be in for the next couple decades.
Mm-hmm.
But
And
I
if it
think it will
doesn't
be.
happen the
I
way
think after violence, I think it'll be a more peaceful one.
for sure, but if it doesn't de-escalate the way I just described, do you think it would escalate up to using tactical nuclear weapons? Do you think he would go that far?
Yeah, I have no idea. Honestly, I've had
Yeah,
opinions on a lot of
I
these
don't think anybody
questions, and
does.
I don't think
Yeah.
anybody does. I think it's I think it's unlikely, right? But that's somewhat assuring. But do I think there's some
Yeah.
probability that, like, if push comes to shove and he thinks it's what requires for him to remain in power, he would use them? Or it is possible. And then I don't know. I don't know what that looks like. That's very scary.
Yeah, maybe again, that's not our business to be in the regime change business. Let the Russians
Yeah,
settle that
that is partly
themselves.
what worries me about making relations with Russia so uncomfortable. Is I think the thing I want, I listen, I want us to deter future autocrats from doing this sort of thing. I want this to be very painful. But sanctions and other, sanctions are a form of conditional repression. If you do X, I will do Y. If you don't do X, I won't do Y. And we're setting up a bunch of things that are not conditional. We're just going to repress. We're going to, like, punish, irrespective of what you do. And that's maybe, and that could make, that's very dangerous to do with a nuclear armed world power.
Or since he controls
I
the
hope our
media,
leaders are doing
his
the
own
fun. Yeah.
if his own
Yeah.
people rise up and say, we're impoverished, and he
Mm-hmm.
says the Americans made this happen, you can blame the Americans. It's their fault.
I mean, he can get away with it. So certainly, he can get away with a lot domestically, as a lot of these autocrats I just mentioned have. So that's partly why I think we might still be with him for 20 years. And I don't. Yeah, we're not. Nobody's very good at regime change, or even knowing which tools work at regime change. Right? I don't think there's no good record of, short of invading that country and toppling them with military superiority, which we do not necessarily have because of these bombs. I don't
Right.
think there's
Even
any
with that
solution.
superiority in Iraq and Libya, it didn't go so well.
I mean, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. We talk about the ones that didn't go well. We don't talk about the ones that did. Nobody talks about the 1994 invasion of Haiti, where the coup
Oh,
leader
right.
gave up before the planes landed, and so I don't want to say that no military intervention or no conditional repression ever works. There's a lot of selection of cases again. And likewise, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire. There's a lot of African countries where this has worked, until it doesn't. So it's a dangerous tool, right? So we shouldn't be too optimistic about it, but nor should we swing too far and think it's never useful.
Very good. Good place to end there, Christopher. What's next on your research? Well, Chicago, you mentioned more. You have a few more years
Chicago,
to
I'm
go on your
going,
Chicago project. Yeah.
and more in Medellin, and I'm starting to spend some time in Mexico, exploring opportunities
Oh,
to, like, understand how organized crime and gang violence works there. That's a place where unlike Medellin, the gangs have not found a way to settle their violence. And it happens amongst very organized groups, which is also unlike Chicago. So I'm kind of fascinated by how things work in Mexico.
is it because of a weak government?
Well, you'll have to ask me back in 5 years to
Okay.
see.
All right. Yes.
But
That'll be
I
your
don't
next
think so.
book.
But I it's too soon to say.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, Christopher. Thanks so much for your work, and thanks for the new book. Congratulations on that, and thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.